Welcome everyone to the November. Goodness sake, it's October. Welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be joined by Duncan Wright, who'll be talking to us about some early medieval castles. And I think that's enough introduction from me. Duncan, we're going to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks for the introduction and for the sort of invite to speak tonight. As you said, it's probably the weather playing my favour. I never thought about tactics of doing Zoom presentations, but I'll think about that in the future. Thanks so much. Lovely to speak to you tonight, especially with a group with such a vested interest in I think in what we're doing and what we've done. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversations afterwards after we share some of our results. I'm presenting tonight on the Where Power Lies project. You might have heard of this before. This was a 2-year AHRC-funded research project led by myself as the principal investigator and then with a co-investigator of Oliver Crichton at the University of Exeter. And the purpose of the project was to look at what we called lordly centres of lordship, of elite power, around the year 1000. But before we get stuck into the archaeology and the castles, I've made very much a conscious effort to include as many castles as possible in this presentation. I actually wanted to start with a bit of etymology. And I start this talk with um, this definition of rich because I think it gives a really interesting insight into the transformations that were happening in England across the 10th century. So the word rich, we're pretty comfortable in the modern sense of its definition, that it's money and affluence. But interestingly, this modern sort of iteration of the word doesn't come about until the second, certainly the third half of the 10th century. Before that, it was probably more equivalent to powerful, to people with authority. But what happens across the course of the 10th century is that we get this burgeoning elite class, not just in Britain, but in across parts of Western Europe. You get a more diverse aristocracy. There are more of them, the nouveau riche, if you want to call them that. And they not only become more prolific, more present, more archaeologically visible, but also they're very much conspicuously showing off their wealth. And so you get this transformation in the word rich that people are no longer just powerful, but they are visibly powerful in the landscape. And I think this is a good sort of entry into what we were trying to understand. We were trying to understand the places that these newly rich people, if you like, how they showed off their wealth. And the primary way they did that was through these centres of lordship, many of which were castles, but many of which weren't. So the castles sort of fit into this broader scope. In terms of the project team, as I said, it's Ollie and I who sort of led the work, but then we had important contributions from Dr. David Gould, Dr. Michael Shapland, and Dr. Scott Chaussee as well. And I should say that we had an official project partner in the Portal Antiquities scheme, and the project sort of lasted for 2 years in total, trying to get for the first time a national picture of the emergence of these lordly centres and the archaeological character of them as well. But before we get on to the project in full, it's important to stress that we did run a pilot study, and that was generously funded by the Castle Studies Trust. This is work you might have seen already at Laughton and Morthen in South Yorkshire. The paper came out in Landscapes maybe about 3 years ago now. And Laughton really worked in many ways as a proof of concept. We thought it was an interesting site in itself, but the CST gave us 3 different tranches of money to first do geophysics, then do some sort of targeted excavation, and follow that up with some reconstruction models as well. And Laughton, it was kind of fascinating because it showed the kind of transformation of a lordly centre from an earlier Saxon site to one that was transformed, I think probably in the wake of the conquest. I was brought to Laughton initially by the the references that many people have cited to Earl Edwin of Mercia having an aula at Laughton. And many sort of commentators previously had said that this aula, this hall of Earl Edwin, probably lies under this beautifully preserved Motte and Bailey Castle at Laughton. And I thought surely archaeology can actually test that and actually demonstrate it. So there were other sort of indicators of early medieval activity and pre-castle activity at Laughton. Firstly, the church has got this amazing pre-conquest porticus in it. And actually, excavation within the village itself has found also pre-conquest activity slightly further to the east of the castle. But our work at Laughton comprised, as I said, three parts. First, we did some geophysical survey, which particularly found, and quite usefully, what looked like enclosures to the south of the castle, and importantly, that was outside of the scheduled area, so we could actually investigate it much more easily than if it was scheduled. But also, what looked like some activity in the Bailey, as you can see, the model from photogrammetry there, very well preserved 3D model showing the preservation of the castle. We followed that up, especially trying to characterize these enclosures at A and B at the south there, because what it looked like was actually enclosures running underneath the castle itself, and especially it looked like the motte was actually plonked straight on top of this enclosure running north-south. Sure enough, our excavation did identify what looked like enclosures. Very frustratingly, this enclosure ditch didn't have any ceramic dating to provide us with a close provenance of this feature. We believe it is almost certainly the pre-castle phase, that it is the kind of outer enclosure of Earl Edwin's Hall complex. But what's quite interesting about the fill of this ditch was it is very, very sandy, very consistent. This is not a feature that was filled up gradually, but actually it far more convincingly looks like a feature that was filled in very, very quickly, perhaps on construction of the castle. So it looks like the enclosures of Edwin's Hall complex were filled in, and then the Motte and Bailey castles built over it anew, including, as I said, that motte slap bang on top of the enclosure ditch. We also had the church analysed. This is again was Michael Shapland. He's pretty sure this is a freestanding tower nave church as well. So you've got this binary residence church sort of relationship going on, and this really was our interest in the project. We could look at manorial sites of all types and flavours, but we decided, given the scope of our work and the I suppose the limit of our funding and our time, to focus on particularly sites that have this binary church and residential components. And these are the funky 3D models that we had done. This was from Pig Hill Archaeological Illustration. This is our sort of very conjectural reconstruction of Earl Edwin's phase. This is the pre-conquest phase. When the castle was actually built, we can't really be sure, but at some point, a castle, Morthen Bailey, is planted on straight on top of it. The church is retained in largely its present, its form until probably the 12th century when it's remodeled. And so yeah, we have this really nice sequence of the castle being, implanted on top of an existing lordly centre at Laughton. And so really that was the kind of the root of the idea. And as I said, trying to demonstrate some of our kind of methodological concepts and some of the kind of idea that we weren't just looking at castles, but looking at a longer jury kind of approach to lordly centres. As I said, the emphasis was really on residential and ecclesiastical components in rural landscapes. Ollie and I are currently writing a book, and we will spread out into urban centres as well. But really, the focus of the project was very much the rural landscape. These are very important places, but these are places that are quite slippery. I think quite difficult to characterize. They tend to get characterized either by their site type, either by Motte and Bailey castles, certain castle types, or by their chronology. So they get called Thainley centres, they get called manorial centres after the conquest, and we were trying to sort of say essentially these things are doing much the same thing. These are centres of lordly power. Their manifestations are different and distinct, and those distinctions are important. But can we look at this in a broader sense and essentially say that many of these places come about from the same impulses? So as we said in that slide there, they are probably one of the most common sites in the English landscape. I think anyone in the rural landscape will be able to walk and find one of these within 5 or 10 minutes of driving, but they're poorly conceptualized. They've got no consistent name. So this project, Where Power Lies, was trying to be the first attempt to characterize the archaeology of these places, their origins in particular, and their earliest development as well. We tried to do that at a number of scales. Now, it's important to stress here that sort of included castles as a form of lordly centre, but we're acutely aware that not all of them are. This lovely image of Danes Castle here at Exeter is a good example of that. It seems to be a temporary siege work of King Stephen, and you cannot really argue that this was a permanent residence in the way that many of our castles were. And that's also a project sort of it risks sort of undermining the distinctiveness of castles as well. And we weren't aiming to do that because castles are clearly distinctive. I think that the first reference to a castle in English, an Old English source, comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 1051. And it said the translation is then that year the foreigners built a castle in Herefordshire. So it's interesting that they use the word foreigners in this context, but also they use not an Old English word, but a Latin word as well, castle, to describe this new thing in the landscape. So castles are clearly importantly different to other types of lordly centre, but for our purposes, we were including it almost as a manifestation of a similar, as I said, impulse to aggrandize individuals and families. So we started the project by looking at the national picture, trying to collate in England all that information for early lordly centres. We used lots of very valuable existing data sets, not least the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture, but also corpus of Romanesque sculpture as well. Many of these sources are problematic because they, are as much a reflection of research trends as they are, realities of the past. But we thought it was important to put all these really valuable data sets, and we're very thankful for everyone who shared their work into one place so people could come and do similar things to us off the back of it. So all these data sets are available on the ADS, the Archaeology Data Service. I'll talk about that towards the end. We also had our own sort of data sets too. Ollie and I have been working on that image to the right there. There's that early castle database for some time. And all of this we're trying to collate into a single place. Also, alongside this, we worked with the Portal Antiquities scheme, trying to model what we thought were sort of aristocratic assemblages and artifact types as well, and that was very important. But it became very clear that certainly within the time frame that we had, we could not approach the kind of level of detail that we would like across the whole of the country. And actually, we could run the risk of saying very little about quite a large area and nothing really meaningful. And off the back of that, then we sort of scaled down. We looked at two macro regions. We worked at sort of a south and southwest region and a northeast region as well. And this is where we really sort of started to burrow down into more of the evidence in more detail. Look at the kind of historic environment records in particularly, and really look at the kind of validity of some of these identifications, because there's massively varying data sets here. Some HERs will label anything that appears in Domesday Book as a lordly centre and just a place name, a dot on a village on a 19th century ordnance survey map. Others are far more rigorous, and so what we did is approach this with our own rigor and try to do as much data cleaning and bring this picture into a more sort of coherent idea of what was genuinely lordly centre and what wasn't. What we started to notice as well was that doing this work, we tried all sorts of different things. We tried to map this stuff to, Anglo-Saxon meeting places. We mapped it to Roman roads with no massively compelling, sort of relationships being identified. What we did find quite early on, though, what's quite interesting, was that we found that many lordly centres, including castles, were actually in areas of relatively low settlement density, especially in what are traditionally termed in medieval studies as dispersed settlement landscapes, which kind of goes against the grain of I think, our idealised image of a lordly centre, especially a castle being at the top of a planned settlement, and that settlement being essentially nucleated. Whether this picture can be really meted out across the whole of the country is debatable, but certainly it suggests that it's that sort of that idealised image of castle or lordly centre with a nucleated settlement around it has perhaps been overemphasised, and we should expect to see these lordly centres in all types of different settlement landscapes. Likewise, the other sort of relationship we found were very compelling between sort of residences, churches, and bits of the landscape was actually watercourses as well. Perhaps this is not surprising. You think, of course, these, especially when it's residences, they need to be close to a source of water. These are elite households that need water for all sorts of different domestic and agricultural activities. But again, the more you burrow down into this evidence, the more you see actually the relationship is probably a little bit more significant. So sometimes the correlations were really striking, like this example here in Wiltshire and Hampshire, where you can see nearly every, many of the residences and ecclesiastical sites are very much located on major watercourses. And I should stress that this image is major watercourses. Um, but what seems to be happening also is the significance of mills is really being meted out by this sort of correlation that we're seeing in the watercourses. So many lordly centres, castles and not castles, incorporate apparently mills into their plans, watercourses either defining the edge of their enclosures or certainly on the periphery, very immediate to it. So it's obvious that mills are absolutely integral to, I think, the foundation of many of these places, not just for the kind of their use as a resource and they're an important resource, but clearly these are a form of power as well. And so I think that's really sort of been evidenced by our work, something that people have commented on before, but I think we're seeing it in a much more profound way through our analysis. But what I'd like to really spend the rest of the time on and the majority of tonight speaking about is the detailed case studies, because I think these will be probably of most interest to everyone. So we went from the national scale, we looked at our macro regions, and on that basis, we then started to look at more detailed case studies, places where we were trying to understand, a bit like Laughton, more of the kind of longue durée of them as lordly centres, and to really try and understand them in unparalleled detail. And so we did a combination of different work. We did our desk-based research, really detailed desk-based assessment of each site and study area. I think we did 9 of them in total. I think we did Earls Barton as a sort of a bonus ball at the end. We did topographic and geophysical survey, and the majority of them, standing building assessment and PAS analysis as well. Now, we didn't always do all of these methods. It did depend on things like access and, really prosaic like vegetation and that kind of thing, logistical things you need to take account of. But we tried to essentially throw as many techniques and methods as we could at each of these case studies. The first one I'd like to speak about is one of the ones we did really quite early in the project, was at the Mound in Great Somerford. And many of you might be aware of this site already. It's relatively well known in relation to Malmesbury. If you can see on the left-hand side here, it lies a few kilometres to the southeast of Malmesbury. It's very much a bit like Laughton exemplifies that very nice sort of castle church binary relationship where you've got a motte that appears to have been flattened. You can see that quite clearly on the LiDAR, standing adjacent to the parish church. Now, the site is slightly complicated because it's clearly been incorporated partly as a garden feature, hence the sort of landscaping of the motte itself. But we sought to explore at Great Somerford some of the archaeology, especially of the mound as it's known. And you get a real sense here of just how close they are. Only a few feet between that flattened motte you can see on the left-hand side and the standing church. In terms of the tenurial background to the site, there is a complex Domesday tenure, which is quite hard to unpick. Lots of different landholders, and it's not really clear on which estate the area was developed, the area in which the motte was developed. Interestingly, I think in the broader context, the motte is often identified as one of those castles built near Malmesbury in the Anarchy by Robert of Gloucester. It's mentioned in I think it's the Deeds of Stephen that three castles are built in or near Malmesbury. Actually, for the Anarchy project, we looked at one of the other contenders for that, at a place called Cam's Hill. So it's an area we know pretty well. Interestingly, I think what particularly brought us to Great Somerford was that the motte was actually excavated in 2 different goes in the early 19th century and the early 20th century as well, so 1811 and 1910. And in both instances, a wall was found. So we knew there's sort of walling within the motte somewhere. And also there is reference to a doorway and two windows. And also in another, in the slightly later work, um, the identification of Norman work as well. So you can see the kind of very grainy image on the right-hand side there, what looks like to be a wall of maybe 2 or 3 feet wide, extending in a linear fashion away from that where that photo is taken. So we're really interested to test what this feature could be. Could it be some sort of pre-conquest, pre-castle tower? Could it be, a chamber? Was it an early church? So we've got several churches on the site. So we sought to try and, through ground penetrating radar to assess this in a bit more detail and characterize it a bit better. There's not loads of evidence for early work in the church. Maybe this fabric included halfway up the tower, might be slightly earlier, but certainly there's no sort of strong indications opposite to Laughton of a pre-conquest centre here. So we're hoping to characterise that a bit further as well. So we surveyed the mound. It didn't take an awful long time, but Scott led this work and did several forwards and backs across the mound, trying to find this building and characterize what it looked like. It's hard to see in this very grainy image, but especially that third one down there, you can start to see a slightly rectilinear feature coming through, and it's actually a bit clearer if we stack it. So if you can see, again, it's slightly eye of faith. I'm afraid I've reduced the quality of the images here to make sure that my PowerPoint ran smoothly. So it's slightly harder to see. So if you want to see high resolution images, as I said again, all our information, all our data is on the ADS website. You can get nice high res images there. But essentially what we identified was a rectilinear feature, maybe with a slight addition to the east of it. And this feature apparently maybe 10 meters in length and 5 in width. Hard to tell, but certainly something there, and something that we could place quite clearly in the Mott as well. And what it did show us was that, firstly, this is very unlikely to be a church because it's not orientated in the right direction. This rectilinear building is instead orientated north-south. Interestingly, too, it's not located in the middle of the Mott as well. It seems to be in a slightly awkward position in the northeast corner. So it's west-east orientated, it's rectangular. None of this really speaks of a tower, of a tower nave church, certainly, and it doesn't speak of a church generally. And yeah, that lack of centralness as well in the Mott is questionable. But it's interesting to reflect on our identification with those, antiquarian records, those records from the 19th and 20th centuries, talking about, the decorative sculpture and the Norman work. I think the most convincing argument or interpretation for this feature might be actually a chamber. Is it stone built with doors and windows, decorative ones? Could this be a pre-castle chamber? And could we really be looking at actually the Mott being potentially a secondary phase that's encasing this feature? It doesn't, again, because of its form, doesn't really look like an emotive tower. It's not central, and it's rectilinear as well. So that was an interesting thing of conclusion from our work at Great Somerford. Perhaps the best known castle site that we looked at for the project was Earls Barton in Northamptonshire, famous primarily for its pre-conquest tower nave church with this wonderful pilaster strip work. Essentially, this tower is meant to look like a wooden tower. It's a wooden tower rendered in stone. It's a very interesting thing. Um, but what's very unusual about Earls Barton is that the building itself, the tower, has been studied for 100 years plus. People have been sort of pondering what this feature might be, and it's the date of the tower, especially, has sort of been debated back and forth. But there's some really interesting landscape context that's been slightly undervalued. There is what looks like a motte immediately north of the church tower. It has been commented on before, but not really surveyed in any real detail. So we've got this kind of very sort of basic earthwork plan that was undertaken, I think, in the 1980s, but no one studied the Mott. It's known as Berry Mount in any detail, and no one's done any geophysical survey as well. So we approached this site looking to understand the landscape around the tower in a bit more detail. And that's a nice drone shot of Bury Mount in the foreground. You can see just how close the Tower Nave Church is there. And that's another good shot of it as well. Again, encapsulating that really nice binary um, church and potential residents at Earls Barton. Should say that people have, thrown lots of different ideas out there. I'm almost certain that this is a castle of some description. It is probably just a motte, and it's built, I'm not sure when, probably in the 12th century. I'll explain why in a minute. But people have hypothesized that this might be Iron Age in date, or even there might be an Anglo-Saxon assembly place as well. I don't think there's a huge amount of evidence for either of those. So we did a photogrammetric model, which is the first time, as I said, this landscape's been modelled in detail. The evidence for a bailey is not, I don't think, massively strong. There are earthworks extending to the north that look like slightly later manorial earthworks, probably extending slightly later in the medieval period. Um, what the photogrammetry does show really nicely is quite how truncated this mound must be. The churchyard is here. You can see the churchyard wall. Follow my mouse there. It's quite clear when you're on the site as well, but this kind of landscaping effect, and the churchyard is dead flat as well. It could have taken place relatively recently in terms of historical terms, maybe in the 18th, 19th centuries. So this feature has been very much truncated. This is the plan of the earthworks. You can see a series of enclosures extending northward. As I said, many of these I think are slightly later. Possibly this one here might be related in a similar way to Laughton. I was only looking at this actually last week in preparation for this talk, and I thought, hang on a minute, maybe the mound, the motte, is put over the enclosure in a similar way to Laughton. Because if you follow it to the south, you can actually see it almost swinging around. It's quite coherent. It looks like the motte is kind of superimposed. So that might be, broadly coterminous with the motte. But many of these features I think are slightly later, and I don't think the idea of it being a traditional motte and bailey again has loads of evidence behind it. So we did lots of geophysics as well as the photogrammetry. We did an Earth resistance survey. Um, but the important piece of what we did, this is Scott operating the GPR, was the radar. On the motte itself, not a huge amount of interesting material was found, but in the churchyard is where the story really got interesting. We found in one phase, lying slightly underneath some later phases, what appeared to be a second church. I can't see with. I'm going to move everyone in my screen there so I can actually point at it properly. But down here, feature A looks like an apsidal ended building lying literally 2 meters to the west of the famous tower nave. The famous tower nave is here, and there is an apsidal ended building starting about 2 meters to the west and extending to the east. The land drops off actually very, very quickly from there, so it can't be a substantial building. That's why we didn't survey it any further to the west. But it looks like we have another church at Earls Barton. Church or maybe a mausoleum. Hard to phase, but it's possible that this could be a late Saxon thing. But yeah, very, very interesting. But the GPR also identified what looked like in a slightly higher horizon, what looked like another long, narrow stone-built building at A. Again, about 5 to 7 meters in width. We didn't really get the end of the terminus, and we didn't really seem to get the top of it, the northern extent of it. But it's very similar in form to the one that we identified at Great Somerford as well. So there is a kind of question here that both sites we looked at with motts adjacent to churches seem to have these 5 to 7 meter wide stone built buildings seemingly underlying the castle. Again, if you sort of even by eye draw your sort of, your motte if in its full extent, would it be a similar thing to a motte maybe being superimposed on a stone built building? This is work that's still ongoing, I should stress. We're doing actually a piece of follow-up work. Um, this is reconstruction broadly of the earlier structure, the western structure, and comparing it to late Saxon mausolea. It's a similar kind of form if we're kind of conjecturing how long it is. and this is what our broad phasing of the site as well. Um, but we're doing further work, so many of our sort of conclusions are slightly tentative at this stage, and our work has now been kind of drawn elsewhere, if you like. We're looking at the excavation of these burials in the 1970s that were not subject to sort of scientific dating, and we're doing that work now. They're very nicely clustering around the 10th, 11th century mark. They're really interesting, these burials. They're all cut directly into the bedrock, which is pretty unusual. As I said, the dating seems to be maybe starting around the year 1000-ish, but maybe creeping into the 12th century. But we're also doing isotopic work as well. So we're hoping to get the isotope initial results in the next few weeks so we can actually have a go at the reconstruction of the biography of these people, because we're pretty sure that this is the first aristocratic burial population at Earls Barton as well. So they're all clustered round the tower. As you can see, the tower's up on the top of the screen there. Um, yeah, very, very interesting. One charcoal barrel, which is almost certainly pre-conquest, but we might have a group going into the 12th century at Earls Barton, and reconciling the identification of the new church, perhaps the chamber, with this burial population. I think will give us a really rich picture of Earls Barton that goes beyond the tower nave, which is beautiful as it is. It's really taken most of the focus up to now. And that's our sort of modelled reconstruction of the dating of those burials. But more to follow, as I said, on Earls Barton. Okay, I've spoken for about half an hour. I'll finish with our case study at Saintbury, which is again is ongoing work, and I think it's interesting in this case. It's slightly different to Earls Barton and Great Somerford. That the castle doesn't seem to be well, it's not. It doesn't seem to be completely de novo, which is interesting. Doesn't seem to be superimposed on an earlier pre-conquest lordly centre, and it's yeah, very interesting landscape altogether. So Saintbury, we were brought here by mostly by this beautiful aerial photograph, which is taken in low light, and it's often been heralded as being a kind of an example of a lordly centre preserved in aspic. So you've got this amazing church of St Nicholas, beautiful church as it is, dating to about 1100. You then have this very clear, sort of broadly oval enclosure extending to the southwest of the church. So we're sort of looking south, this photograph. What looks like a kind of concentration of an inner enclosure immediately adjacent to the church, but then beautifully preserved ridge and furrow. Earthworks on top of the hill as well. So Saintbury is halfway down the Cotswold Scarp. It's absolutely stunning location. When your back is to the hill, you have a 180-degree view of essentially the central Midlands. You are looking at a, a real view shed when you're up on the hill. And increasingly, we're aware of some amazingly long distance earthworks, including this one dropping down the hill at Saintbury as well. So it's a very, very interesting landscape. Um, Work has been done here before, not archaeological work, but John Blair in particular has had an interest in Saintbury. His analysis of the place name, which is Saywines Burr, he's argued that names with SAE in them don't really come around till around the year 1000 or perhaps after it. So it's probable that Saywins Burr and Saintbury as a place name is a product of the kind of the late Saxon period. It's interesting that Saywine appears as one individual, perhaps several individuals, are named as Money and also as the Reeve of Bristol in the early to mid 11th century. We've got Saywine coins minted at Bristol, Exeter, Lidford, and elsewhere. Um, my own sort of exploring of the site as well is notice that at the conquest at 1066, the individual who owns Saintbury is this chap called Senwig Cheller. He owns 10 hides here, and it's interesting that he seems to be a moneyer as well. So Senwig is not a common name; it only appears on coins as well. So it seems to be an exceptionally rare name. and we have it in coins from London in the late 1030s. So we started to think, is there an association specifically with moneyers and moneyers of status? We're not suggesting that these individuals are the ones hammering out the coins necessarily, but almost that they're, you know, royal, quasi-royal appointments. And it's interesting that completely separately, Stephen Baxter suggested that Cell's estates may have been held ex officio. So are these, is Saintbury and some other estates associated with it almost a sort of grace and favour estate for loyal thanes? For individuals who have these ministerial appointments, particularly those money as and those of status. So, in a similar way to the previous examples, we threw as much as we could at Saintbury. We did our photogrammetric survey, especially focusing on the enclosure southwest of the church. This kind of unprecedented detail straight away makes you see that actually what we thought was a nice, consistent curving enclosure actually is actually made up of linear components, suggesting potentially at different phases. Also, you get a really clear sense here of quite how busy that inner enclosure is at southwest of the church. It's very, very interesting. A real complexity of activity going on. We backed that up with geophysical survey as well. Both sides of the church was very important. You can see how busy that material is there. We focused actually. I just finished excavations at Saintbury this summer in August. So we focused an excavation on this feature here that came through in the mag, what looked like a large building, but also another excavation to the northeast of the church. So just bear that in mind when I talk about it in a minute. But also our radar brought similar results, that kind of sense of busyness and activity southwest of the church. As I said, we excavated those two foci, anticipating to find southwest of the church that manorial focus, and also trying to really test, in particular, what this big enclosure ditch may have been. I should say that we got Tim Kinneard involved in our work and Sam Turner, who did some OSL dating for us. And they actually identified that the big enclosure, this one here, and one of the ones on the inside, was actually dating not to the medieval period. And it wasn't just a perfectly preserved manorial centre, but actually these earthworks have their origins in the Iron Age, which is really very interesting. So it's a feature that is it begins in the kind of Iron Age, maybe the early Roman period. There is then a very clear Middle Saxon phase, 7th and 8th century phase. We're pretty sure that this is a Minster phase, that time of the site that it's occupied by an ecclesiastical community. And only later, around the year 1000, does it become a kind of a lordly centre. And interestingly, the more we looked at these sites in detail, the more seemed to have evidence for Middle Saxon ecclesiastical foci. It's what we call a secularization process. Perhaps quite weakened Anglo-Saxon monasteries are going to get kind of hoovered up by lordly powers around the year 1000. So our work at Slate was very interesting. As I said, we found that the manorial stuff, as we anticipated, to the southwest of the church, that big anomaly wasn't a nice big Saxon church, unfortunately, but actually a post-medieval stables. But you can't have everything. Found a very nice Iron Age enclosure filled with Roman material. But at the very end of the excavation as well, we'd found some residual Middle Saxon pot, but not loads. We did actually identify a Middle Saxon hoard, located initially by a metal detectorist, who left it in the ground, which is good of him. We left this until I think the penultimate day, not thinking there would be much potentially there. And it's absolutely typical. We went started finding this very potentially very important Middle Saxon material. So in amongst this, we've got a plough, you can see there, a lead tank, some beautifully included anor bone as well, which we've sent away for radiocarbon dating. So thanks to Paddy Gleeson and Queens for providing those. We think it's probably 8th century in date, this hoard. There's the tank. Again, we're waiting conservation and cleaning of this. This is on my kitchen table, so it's far from ideal. Um, The plough, I mean, the plough in itself could be really nationally very important if it does end up being 8th century, just from where it is in the country in Gloucestershire, and being potentially a heavy plough. But again, more analysis is needed before conclusions are reached. And this is some of the other material we found as well: some chest fittings, a piece of a bone comb here, and sitting above it all, this chat of about 720-ish, which is hopefully providing our leading date, but the radiocarbon date should help uh, define that. So what at the castle? That's not a castle site. Why have I included it? Well, at Saintbury, it's really interesting where the castle ends up going. The menorah site seems to continue probably until the 13th, 14th century. That's what the pottery is hinting at the kind of the site we excavated. That site is in the far top left-hand corner of the screen you can see. At Saintbury, we seem to have a castle established where this feature called earthwork is. Whether it's a castle or not has been a little bit debated. It's first recorded by an Ordnance Survey archaeologist in 1936 as a castle, but it's never published as such. And it's not included as a castle in the usual gazetteers. So by King and Wren, they omit it. We're pretty sure it is a castle, but it has had a long and complex life. Significantly, they don't chuck this castle on top of our site, on top of the existing Lordley Centre, but they put it here. I'm pretty sure it's put here for kind of almost strategic reasons. It's got a cracking view of the north, but also has a very good view over the local Roman road. But perhaps more importantly, it has a view over this thing here called the Kiftsgate Stone, which is is an Anglo-Saxon assembly site. It's been suggested before that it's a sort of a local 100 meeting place. I think it's far more important. I think it's probably a royal one, and probably sort of supra-regional assembly site. There's lots of indicators for that. Its royal name is perhaps indicated by I think it's called King's Meadow, the adjacent field, but there are other indicators as well. But in terms of the castle, I think its interpretation has probably been muddied a little bit because it was used as a prospect mound for this property called Weston Park, and it's been quarried as well. But if you look at it in the LiDAR, you can see the kind of the motte and the bailey. There is this is from quarrying and an upcast, so people have often called it a double motte. I think that's misleading. I think this is potentially the motte. It's been reused and it's definitely been straightened up for use as a prospect mound. So I think that's probably confused interpretation. As I said, its strategic location is really interesting. You know, why castles are not plonked on manorial centres or are, we've never found the answer to that. Why does Laughton it go exactly on top of the site at Saintbury? It's moved uphill, but I think it's probably because this landscape is one primarily, its primarily importance is actually of assembly. It's a whole landscape where people are assembling. Um, so as I said, the castle you can see there is the star. The Kissgate Stone is intervisible. It's also intervisible with the Roman road you can see running, the purple line you can see running down the screen. And it has a decent, especially view looking north down Ripnell Street across the landscape. As I said, this is a site of assembly. We have the three shires interlocking here. So you're very much, at Saintbury, your border, the county border is literally the parish to Worcestershire, and it's very short distance then to Warwickshire as well. But you sit in Gloucestershire. And I think this is a place that people have assembled for an awful long time. Back to when, it's unsure. But I think you've got a sort of residual element of that assembly in the Cotswold Olympic Games. So I've started to look into these, assembly sites and their afterlives, if you like. And many have these interesting afterlives. The Cotswold Olympics is started in the early 17th century. No one really knows why they choose here, but I think it's probably because people are assembling here already and are assembling from a wide area because I think it's one of these supra-regional assembly sites. Just to finish then as well, the potential for Saintbury Castle to be understood slightly further in a slightly different way has come about from some human remains that were found in 2016 on the southeast slopes of the Bailey. Nothing's been done with this assemblage yet, but this looks like material that seems to be coming from well inside the castle earthwork, probably from a badger churning it all out. It looks like potentially a single disturbed burial, and I'm currently hunting around for funding to try and get this radiocarbon dated because it might be medieval, it might be castle and help us locate the castle, but we can't rule out that this could be a prehistoric monument that's been reused as well. My thanks to Anna Morris and James Tongue, who have both work for the Gloucester Archaeology Service and who alerted me to this assemblage and are currently looking after it for me. So coming to an end now, just to say, as I said earlier, that we've all of our information, all our individual reports for each site, but also photographs, original data sets, all our geophysical survey data is available in raw formats, all to download from the Archaeology Data Service. We've got papers in MSR, Medieval Settlement Research, and also one in the Antiquaries Journal. We've got a further paper coming out in early medieval Europe as well about actually that theme of reuse of earlier sites. So please, access those at your will, but also contact me if there's something you're interested in. So to conclude then, we try to approach castles as lordly centres and move beyond the kind of categorisation of defence, trying to look at broader themes of function, significance, and chronology. Have we got potential chambers at Great Somerford and Earls Barton? You probably can answer that better than I can, but I think it's interesting that we've got these stone-built buildings apparently being superseded by the mottes in both of those occasions. Um, Saintbury is very interesting that we've got this castle location shaped by probably administrative geography, even though we have a very important lordly centre that is already in the landscape. But we've got that open question of whether it's reusing an earlier burial site and one that I hope to pursue. Ultimately, every site is unique, and the more you throw at it, the more you kind of find, and so requires dedicated sort of local study. But more common traits are emerging. I've not mentioned sundials, for example, or things like the size of enclosures, which is very consistent. But those are all things that, again, that we'll probably bring out in the book. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.